A critic once opined that Shakespeare had an ambiguous and uncomfortable relationship with women. Lady Macbeth and Gertrude are always trotted out as evidence of this point. But a comparison of primary female to male villains in the Shakespeare canon reveals that the bard created about the same number and quality of evildoers in each gender. Measured by number and quality, the bard also found men and women about equally heroic. Perhaps the critic had a more ambiguous and uncomfortable relationship with women than the bard. Elizabethan women's legal rights were very restricted by our modern standards. Unmarried women and their marriages were controlled by their fathers. Disobedience was a sin. The bard was criticizing, not advocating the Athenian law that imposed a sentence of death or a nunnery on Hermia if she didn't marry her father's choice in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Once married, women became non-entities. They were called covert, that is, veiled, unable to own property in their own rights, enter into a binding contract in their own name, or collect revenue from their own lands without their husband's express permission. For a woman, by law, a husband was thy lord, thy life, thy keeper, thy head, thy sovereign. When you consider English law, sarcasm drips off of every cutting word in Caterina's closing speech in Taming of the Shrew. Again, the bard was criticizing, not defending, the Italian law on married English women's shockingly inferior rights. His heroines showcase their intelligence to solve problems that men often fail to solve. They get angry, very angry, at the morals and laws that restrict them from acting as men do. They joke and play well at battles of wit, more often than not skewering their male companions. They suffer, and dead or alive, they triumph. These characters don't indicate an author mired in ambiguity, unease, or mistrust about women. Rather, they indicate his admiration and championing of us. Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, was a lifelong admirer of Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier, paying for a Latin translation at 21. One of the groundbreaking hallmarks of The Courtier was that it argued strongly that many virtues of the mind are as necessary for a woman as for a man. Rather than silent consorts, women have such qualities in common with the courtier as wisdom, nobleness, courage. Measured by the women closest to him, as you've heard earlier today, Oxford preferred intelligent, literate, well-educated women who, like the bard's heroines, found in difficult circumstances the wisdom, nobleness, and courage to tell the truth and speak their minds. This lecture is about one of those women, Oxford's first wife, Anne Cecil. So, what's commonly known about Anne Cecil? She was born in December 1556 to William Cecil, Lord Burghley, and his wife Mildred. Her younger brother Robert figured testily in Oxford's life after Anne's death. Her grandfather, Sir Anthony Cook, tutor to Edward VI, had educated her mother and aunts in Greek, Latin, French, Italian, and some Hebrew. If educated like or by her mother and aunts, Anne studied theology, the medicinal quality of herbs, dancing, music, and Cicero, Virgil, Livy, Ovid, Homer, Terrace, and Horace. Her grandfather's goal was to ensure his daughters might have complete men and that their husbands might be happy and complete women. Although betrothed at 13 to Philip Sidney, nephew to the all-powerful Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, her father broke that contract when Leicester would not make up for Sidney's slender purse. Burghley offered her to another ward, the Earl of Rutland. She married Oxford at 15. They became immediately estranged for 5.5 years without explanation, and it is generally assumed that Oxford was at fault. While he was on a diplomatic mission abroad, she delivered a daughter in July 1575. Oxford and others claimed the child was not his. Scandal ensued. Oxford had an illegitimate son in March 1582 with the witty, vivacious Anne Vavasour. Anne Cecil and Oxford reconciled in December 1581, following which she delivered 2 more surviving daughters and lost an infant son. She was interested in medicinal elixirs. She died at 31 in Greenwich Palace under the care of Queen Elizabeth and her parents while Oxford was fighting the Armada. She is buried in an enormous tomb in Westminster Abbey. A long Latin inscription by her father emphasizes her obedience to all female Tudor virtues. And here is the one surviving representation of Anne from that tomb. And that sums up her life, except of course it doesn't. Today we'll explore Anne's character when she married Oxford, how circumstances and politics wildly beyond her control led her to reveal the most powerful secret in Elizabeth's reign, and how she was immortalized in the Shakespeare canon after her death, first and most importantly, as Lucrece in 1594. So, let's time travel to a few pivotal moments in her life and watch what Anne does. Imagine we are standing in the now destroyed chapel at Whitehall Palace on December 16, 1571, to witness Anne's second attempt to marry Oxford. 3 couples kneel before the altar. Thin winter sunlight pierces through this stained glass window to our left. We can smell the wedding feast next door in the great hall with its famous oak beam ceiling, and the Queen sits in the transept balcony just behind us. Whispers buzz. Why did Anne's first attempt to marry Oxford in September at Theobald's, her father's opulent country estate, fail? After the Queen had arrived, after Burghley had read us his Latin wedding poem, Gratularium, and distributed it by pamphlet all over London, why had the groom failed to appear? The entire court had withdrawn awkwardly to nearby estates. Was it because Burghley had just imprisoned Oxford's first cousin, the Duke of Norfolk, in the Tower for treason? Strangely, Oxford's original marriage contract to either of the Hastings sisters, great-great-grandnieces of Edward IV, had been broken, and not by the underage Oxford. Elizabeth Hastings is standing next to him, marrying the Earl of Somerset instead. Maybe this Cecil marriage is the price the Queen extracted for the return of his lands she took during his wardship. She hasn't returned them, although she should have by law on his 21st birthday in April. Maybe this rich young nobleman who turns every female hail at court is Burghley's payment for services to the crown. Remember how Pericles realizes and then struggles in Simonides' trap to snag him for his daughter? Then pity this short, plain girl attempting a marriage we know she failed to secure 3 months ago. Contrary to that jovial letter written by Lord St. John to the Earl of Rutland in France, Mistress Anne Cecil had not caught Oxford at all. She was a pawn to her father's ambition. Secretary of State and Lord Privy Seal by the time of Anne's marriage, William Cecil had been elevated by the Queen to first Baron of Burghley the same year Anne married Oxford. His biographer, Stephen Alford, calls him the most adept politician of his age. Almost condemned for treason under Mary, under Elizabeth, Burghley became the second most powerful man in the country after the Earl of Leicester. He amassed an enormous personal fortune and epitomized the rise of the middle-class striver, launching his family into the nobility through fierce loyalty to the Protestant Elizabeth. He was a controlling, hard-working micromanager, a spy master exceptionally skilled at refashioning the truth and distancing himself from any risks or lies. He and Oxford, whose family's name and nature insisted on the absolute truth, however painful or inconvenient, conflicted repeatedly. Less generally known is the medal of Anne's exceptionally formidable mothers and aunts. None of Mildred Cook Cecil, Anne Cook Bacon, or Elizabeth Cook Hobie Russell fit the compliant, retiring Tudor role model set for noble women. Each was an indomitable political force, and together they were the primary female influences in Anne's life. Militantly Puritan and outspoken, these women formed a web of connections, information, and power behind their husbands. The finest mind of the three rested atop the crooked spine of Mildred, Anne's mother. Grim, determined, and razor-sharp, Mildred could converse fluently in French, Latin, and ancient Greek. Evidence from her correspondence indicates that she created a large part of the renowned private library at Cecil House, where so many of the bard's sources are found. That library fed the agile mind of Oxford and the other royal wards, handpicked to live with the Cecils. Raised by these dominating, demanding personalities, it is no wonder Anne began her life as an obedient, pious mouse, traded by her ambitious father from Sydney through Rutland and foisted upon Oxford without a squeak. Let's visit another pivotal period in Anne's life. In September 1574, she wrote to the Earl of Sussex, Oxford's cousin and Lord Chamberlain, responsible for court bedroom assignments. She begged him for better rooms at Hampton Court, so that the willinger, I hope, my lord, my husband, to come thither. Someone had assigned Anne small, remote rooms, and 3 years into her marriage, she was not pregnant. Oxford had spent minimal time with her. How humiliating to ask for help in this delicate matter. As a Tudor noblewoman and an earl's wife, marrying chaste and delivering a legitimate male heir were Anne's only jobs. Beginning in autumn 1572, there had been signs that another woman was keenly pursuing Oxford. Anne had been barred from her husband's bedchamber at their house in Wivenhoe in October. The next year, he had rented rooms in London from the Twine brothers and at the Savoy. Although Anne and her mother complained to her father about the other woman in May 1573, Burghley did nothing. The other woman was beautiful, rich, intelligent, well-educated, very witty, and the center of attention at court. Like Anne, she had known Oxford well since he was 12. At 39, this rival had mastered the arts of flirting, romance, and sex. She was the only woman in England to whom no man could say no, and no woman would dare challenge, much less a teenager whose father's position and family fortune depended entirely on her rival's good graces. She was the only Venus, the goddess of love, of countless contemporary poems and plays. How history and the bard's first published work, Venus and Adonis, line up to reveal Queen Elizabeth's seduction of Oxford when he was 23, Elizabeth's delivery of Oxford's first son in late May 1574, and why Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece are an inseparable pair, are the subject of a podcast and another lecture. Time limits us today to briefly introduce only 3 of the several disinterested contemporary witnesses to those events. Gilbert Talbot wrote to his father, the Earl of Shrewsbury, that Oxford had great credit with the Queen, that she delighted more in his personage, dancing, and valiantness than any other. Gilbert went on to say that Mildred Cecil had unwisely declared herself jealous, which has come to the Queen's ear, and that Burghley winketh at these love matters and will not meddle in any way. Instead, Burghley employed Bernard Dewhurst to spy and report back on Oxford's comings and goings with the Queen. Mary, Queen of Scots, wrote her cousin Elizabeth in French. Even il Comte d'Oxford dare not cohabit with his wife for fear of losing the favor which he hoped to receive by courting a youth. The birth and identity of the little love god was the Elizabethan reign's most powerful state pseudo-secret because the succession was England's most urgent internal political issue. Robert Prechter discovered that William Warner, in his 1606 Albion's England, explained why all English heirs apparent have been called Prince of Wales with these shattering words, "Till our queen deceased concealed her heir, I wot not for what skill." Warner's contemporaneous report that Elizabeth had a son who survived until at least 1603, the heir, who would have been Prince of Wales if she had not concealed him, changes the tide of history. But to Anne, this son was an unbearable humiliation. The Queen had achieved what Anne had not, given Oxford a son. This is the secret that Anne will later reveal with a roar. For now, in 1574, the court gossips. Poor Countess of Oxford, she's lost her husband to the Queen, and he fathered a son for her. The Countess has not been pregnant. Is their marriage even consummated? A Tudor wife's known infidelity labeled her husband a cuckold, and subjected him to ridicule. A wife's bastard, particularly a son, was an intolerable dishonor, especially for an earl with a bloodline back to William the Conqueror. Tudor law exculpated the woman only for rape. However, conception, even from a rape, implied the woman's consent. To our modern minds, this is barbaric. The rape victim was deemed innocent unless she became pregnant, because the law deemed conception could not biologically occur without her consent. Obviously, a victim's husband's rights outweighed hers if she unluckily conceived her rapist's child. In early October 1574 at Hampton Court, an angry Oxford made a mistake he regretted for the rest of his life. Openly, in the presence chamber, he announced that if Anne were pregnant, it was not by him. Maybe he'd been told he couldn't go abroad unless Anne were pregnant. Maybe he retorted to the Queen's reconciliation with her longtime lover, Leicester, who had recently abandoned Douglas Sheffield and their bastard son, born in August. But someone with an axe to grind against Oxford and Burghley heard those words and took his revenge through Anne. We don't have direct evidence, but we do have circumstantial evidence of whom to suspect. The anonymous 1584 Leicester's Commonwealth says that Leicester purposefully sowed discontent between Oxford and Anne because Leicester bore Burghley an ancient grudge, but it doesn't say what. Anne's aunt, Elizabeth Cook's first husband, was Thomas Hoby. When he died unexpectedly in Paris in 1566 as ambassador to France, an unopened letter from Burghley was found among Hoby's papers and forwarded to Leicester. In it, Leicester read Burghley's instructions to his brother-in-law Hoby to do everything in Hoby's power to defame Leicester in France and to drive a wedge between Leicester and the Queen. Leicester confronted Burghley with the incontrovertible proof that Burghley was using Hoby to smear him. Raping Burghley's daughter and Oxford's virgin wife, especially after Oxford's son with the Queen and his announcement in court, would have been a double revenge for Leicester. While it is possible that Anne took a lover, her Puritan upbringing and obedient, modest personality makes that very unlikely. Rape is much more consistent with what Anne does, which two more disinterested, contemporaneous witnesses will describe. By early December 1574, as Oxford was preparing for France and Italy, Anne was vomiting with morning sickness. Either she confessed or he deduced her pregnancy. The effect of the news and the looming dishonor must have sent Oxford reeling. One option, to make her infidelity public and throw Anne aside. Even if it had been rape, the law permitted it. But he didn't. Instead, he and Anne reached out to an old friend for help. On December 7th, 1574, Anne was 2 months pregnant. Sir Thomas Smith, Oxford's childhood tutor and a Cecil family friend, wrote a sheepish letter to an enraged Mildred Cecil, trying to explain why he had given Oxford a distillation for Anne that contained 2 abortives, fennel and angelica water. Mildred believed initially that Anne was finally pregnant with Oxford's heir. It was inconceivable that Smith would send an abortive or that Oxford or Anne would request it. Smith writes, "Madam, I sent yesterday of my water to my lord for my lady of Oxford." If Smith had meant that the my lord was any lord other than Oxford, he would have specified the name, but he didn't. Smith sent the distillation to Oxford for Anne. Methinks there's some doubt made of it. Indicates that Mildred sent him a howler of a letter. Smith backpedals. Hey, it's organic, he's taking it himself, and the fennel and the angelica water can be vomited out. Really? Then sworn to secrecy, I can say no more. But I would be as sorry that my lady of Oxford should miscarry as if she were 5 times my daughter. Smith would be sorry if his distillation, with 2 abortives, caused Anne to miscarry her child. There is the first confirmation that Anne was pregnant, not just ill. Smith tried to soothe Mildred, suggesting that by giving a spoonful, if life were in the body, for it should disperse straight and comfort immediately the vital spirits. Since Anne wasn't dead, if life were in the body can only mean she's pregnant. A happily pregnant Anne would have told her mother the good news and not sought an abortive. If Oxford were the father or did not know she was pregnant, he would not have helped her abort his child, who might be the next Earl of Oxford. Instead, he asked Smith for and received an abortive, wrote his will in December, leaving Anne nothing above her statutory 1/3 dower and nothing for the unborn child that wasn't his. Instead, his sister Mary was his heir. By the first week in February, he left for France. On March 7, 1575, while Oxford was in Paris, our second eyewitness, Dr. Richard Masters, wrote Burghley about how, at Burghley's request, Masters had told the Queen that Anne was pregnant. Burghley was avoiding telling her himself. Masters related how well Burghley's excuse to the Queen for not telling her earlier worked. Because your lordship did fear the concealing of it any longer, doubting lest the matter might otherwise come to the court, your lordship thought it good and a piece of duty to have it imparted unto her majesty rather by yourself than by any other. But Burghley did send someone else with the iffy news. He sent Masters. If Anne's pregnancy were joyful news, Burghley would have delivered himself. Instead, he concealed it for 5 months and sent someone else to tell Elizabeth. By now, almost everyone, especially Burghley, knew first that Anne's marriage was likely unconsummated and thus subject to annulment, and second, that Oxford had been the touchy Queen's lover. She might think Anne an adulteress, or worse, be jealous. According to Masters, the Queen sprang up from her cushions in surprise. Then Masters showed the Queen Anne's calculations of her missed menses and revealed that my lady, being here at Shrovetide, had dealt with me to prepare some medicines ad menses promotionis for the promotion of menstrual bleeding, that is, an abortive. I counseled her to stay a while. Why show the Queen a married woman's personal menstrual calendar? Burghley was trying hard to prove Oxford's paternity, to protect Anne's reputation, and to forestall annulment. However, with Smith's prior letter to Mildred and Masters' slip-up about the second abortive, we know Anne tried to end her pregnancy at least twice. Masters described Anne's extreme distress. Her face was much fallen and thin, with little color, and when she was comforted and counseled to rejoice, she would cry, "Alas, how should I rejoice, seeing that he who should rejoice with me is not here? And to say truth, I stand in doubt whether he pass upon me and it or not." Masters and Burghley knew not only that miserable Anne wanted to end her pregnancy, they knew she was uncertain what Oxford had decided to do about it and her. Masters wrote that the Queen was in great offense with my Lord Oxford, repeating the same to my Lord of Leicester after he came to her. By sharing his daughter's private menstrual records through Masters, Burghley had tried to cast Oxford as a liar and an uncaring husband who left his tearful pregnant wife for the continent and to set up the Queen to call Oxford home. Oxford's letters to Burghley reveal that Oxford didn't fall for it. Traditionally, Oxford has been seen as curiously rude and ill-tempered in those letters, and now I hope you know why. Instead of being impulsive and hot-headed, Oxford delicately fenced with the most powerful and capable politician of the Tudor century. Those are Alfred's words. The stakes were very high. Oxford was but 25, Burghley 55. In the context of Oxford's having known for months that Anne's child was a bastard, his sarcastic tone in this opening to his March 1575 letter from Paris becomes clear, as does his superb workmanship and his tactical intelligence. Oxford ensured his letter's survival in Burghley's files by cloaking his meaning, which Burghley would not have missed, in purposely ambiguous pleasantries, a tone very familiar to readers of the canon. Oxford says Burghley's letters have made him a glad man. But like Henry V, upon receiving the insulting tennis balls, we are glad the Dauphin is so pleasant with us. And Hamlet to Rosencrantz, I am glad of it. A knavish speech sleeps in a foolish ear. Oxford's sarcasm portends the power of his anger. He parries back Burghley's sanctimonious good fortune. Anne's pregnancy is bad news for everyone. His Paris letter is dated only 10 days after Masters revealed Anne's condition to the Queen. In prior letters, of which your former mentioned doubtfully, Burghley had been fishing to see whether Oxford would accept paternity if Anne were pregnant. But finally, Burghley had to confirm it to Oxford because he dared not wait any longer to tell the Queen. Oxford had known for months. Oxford twists Burghley's pretense of thanking God for his fatherhood by referencing not Anne's undelivered child of unknown gender, but rather his own son, delivered by the Queen. For now that it hath pleased God to give me a son of mine own, as I hope it is, that last bit, that doubly ambiguous twist of the blade of questionable fidelity, strikes both the Queen and, glancing rather obviously off of Anne, rests its point just above her father's heart. Oxford acknowledges that Burghley already is a grandfather by his elder son, Thomas Cecil. If Anne delivers a boy, Oxford says he shall partake with Burghley in a greater contentation, likely Burghley's phrase, for Burghley's new bastard grandson, but it's far off from returning to England because of it. Whatsoever becomes of Oxford abroad, he says he will leave behind only one child. Remember, this is 6 years before he meets Anne Vavasor, to supply his duty and service either to his prince, if Oxford lives to return to England, to the Queen and that princely son, or else to his country. If Oxford dies abroad, he has served his country because he supplied the necessary male heir to the throne. Oxford is not surprised at Anne's pregnancy, nor will he accept her bastard. It will not bring him home. Instead, his paternity of the heir to the throne entitles him to continue his travels. He implies that Burghley can take it up with the Queen if he doesn't like it. This excerpt from Oxford's April 26, 1576 letter to Burghley clearly shows that Oxford intended to deal with Anne's disgrace privately with Burghley, not to shame her publicly, although she'd become the fable of the world by unknown means, and was shaming him. Oxford blamed Burghley for how badly things were turning out for Anne. After he received news of her delivery, Oxford sent Anne from Venice a gift of a little New Testament with a Latin poem he composed on its flyleaf. The poem plays continually on Vere as true and truth. Only true things last. The rest fly away empty. Therefore, since you are a true Vere woman, a true Vere spouse, a parent of a true Vere daughter, hoping for a true Vere son, be a lover of the truth. Have the truth as your motto. His message is consistently to be worthy of what you are and what you want. Tell the truth, Anne. The action in the Rape of Lucrece, the second work published under the name William Shakespeare, varies significantly from its classical sources, Ovid's Fausti and Livy's History of Rome. The Bard's text contains hundreds of lines of new material found nowhere else, including a stunning 800-line soliloquy by a woman who speaks her mind. Neither classical source blames Collatine, Lucrece's husband, for her rape, because Tarquin's lust is inflamed when he sees Lucrece. In the Bard's version alone, Collatine's words inflame Tarquin. The Bard dashes waves of blame over Collatine in intensity and number, which emphasizes his responsibility for the tragedy. Collatine unwisely publicly praised Lucrece's chastity, just as Oxford unwisely publicly trumpeted that Anne would not be pregnant by him. The Bard's Collatine has a shallow tongue. He is an ungenerous spendthrift. He unlocked the treasure of his happy state. Night, time, and opportunity are raked over the coals in Lucrece's soliloquy. Oxford was likely sleeping elsewhere in Hampton Court the night Anne was raped, thus giving the rapist all he needed. This poem is a mea culpa. In the classical sources, Collatine reacts to his wife's rape immediately with comfort and forgiveness. The bard's Collatine is speechless due to grief and shock for 110 lines. His breathing becomes so labored that he hyperventilates. Only after Lucrece's death does he start as if from a dream and explain. This is Oxford, under his new pseudonym, explaining why he could not speak about Anne's rape for 20 years. The bard's Lucrece is a fair, in which we hear fair, Vere. His Tarquin knows she's a virgin, which the classical Lucrece was not. I must deflower. I come to scale thy never-conquered fort. The fault is thine, as the stained sheets testify. He moves confidently in the dark to Lucrece's chamber, like the draught through the little vents and crannies of a palace he knows curiously well. Locks yield as if he had a passkey. A clock, like the unique clock still at Hampton Court, that has no minute hand, stops the hourly dial till every minute pays the hour his debt. While we do not know for certain who Anne's Tarquin was, the bard's clues include repeated references to his eyes. The queen gave pet names to many courtiers. Leicester's was her eyes. His letters to her include a little drawing of them before his signature. The bard calls Tarquin's eyes traitors, lustful, willing, burning, dead-killing, heavy, eager, still-gazing, stranger, and when he enters Lucrece's chamber, Tarquin rolls his greedy eyeballs in his head. Tarquin is an eyesore in his golden coat, and colored with his high estate, hides base sin in pleats of majesty. While the classical Tarquin was a prince, Leicester was known for seducing women, poisoning men who stood in his way, and using the pleats of his lover's royal skirts as protection from retribution. Nearly everyone in the bard's version knows as a fact, both before and in the few hours between the rape and her suicide, that Lucrece will become pregnant that fateful night. Tarquin, so thy surviving husband shall remain the scornful mark of every open eye. Thy kinsmen hang their heads at this disdain, thy issue blurred with nameless bastardy. Lucrece, this bastard graft shall never come to growth. He shall not boast who did thy stock pollute, that thou art doting father of his fruit. Nor shall he smile at thee in secret thought, nor laugh with his companions at thy state. The bard, this momentary joy breeds months of pain. This hot desire converts to cold disdain. Does Tarquin sound like a rapist motivated by revenge against his victim's husband and father? Does Lucrece sound like a woman who wants an abortive? Does the bard sound like a husband whose wife conceived a bastard child due to rape and who must decide whether to believe her and accept ridicule to save her? Contrary to the classically silent Lucrece, the bard not only verbally defends herself against her rapist for 75 lines, she declares, "For me, I am mistress of my fate." Contrary to that critic's opinion about his ambiguous, troubled relationship with women, the bard not only champions us at our lowest ebb, he empowers us. His Lucrece delivers one devastating blow after another. She reveals Leicester's sexual relationship with the queen and his rapes of her ladies-in-waiting. She wants to share her pain with his other victims, but she knows she can't. Or Tarquin knight as he is but night's child, the silver shining queen he would disdain. Her twinkling handmaids too, by him defiled, through night's black bosom should not peep again. When she turns her anger and her nails at Helen of Troy, a well-known stand-in for Queen Elizabeth, just as New Troy was well known to be London, she goes explosive, hurling accusations one after another that Helen was the source of all Lucrece's personal woes. Show me the strumpet that began this stir, that with my nails her beauty I may tear. Like Helen, the queen was called ever beautiful, even in 1594. Though lampooned in Venus Adonis as foul, wrinkled, old, ill-natured, Lucrece calls her a strumpet. My heat of lust fond Paris did incur this load of wrath. that burning Troy doth bear. Thy eye kindled the fire that burneth here. Lucrece accuses Paris's lust and his burning eye of causing Troy, London, to burn in political unrest. During 1593, young, unemployed, and violent men filled London streets. 12,000 died in London alone due to plague. Famine followed, and the Queen fled. It is not difficult to recognize that the Queen's Paris is Leicester, her eyes. And here in Troy, for trespass of thine eye, the sire, the son, the dame, the daughter die. Why should the private pleasure of some one become the public plague of many more? Through Lucrece, the bard calls his 60-year-old monarch a strumpet, whose paramour's lust caused public political plague and individual suffering. Through Lucrece, Oxford takes his revenge for the crime about which his father-in-law, the second most powerful man in England, the man who put an anointed queen's head on a block, did nothing for his daughter because he was afraid of the first most powerful man in England. Does anyone think it was a good idea for the bard to have put his real name on this poem? In early May 1583, 1 month after the death of her younger sister, Anne delivered Oxford a son. He died 2 days later. The next year, poems headed 4 epitaphs made by the Countess of Oxenford after the death of her young son, Lord Bulbeck, were published in Pandora, a slender book of poetry dedicated to Oxford, together with jarringly awful verses attributed to a John Southern. Sooth, as in truth, as in Vere, as in maybe another pseudonym, and a sonnet attributed to the Queen. Here is one of Anne's poems. Anne's references to the Queen are unmistakable and identical to those of countless contemporary playwrights and poets. She is Venus, a goddess, Aphrodite. According to Anne, Elizabeth cried over the dead infant's body. Anne describes the Queen's face as doleful and washed with golden tears, inveighing the skies. Then, from the depths of her anguish, Anne Cecil de Vere unleashes her pent-up fury and roars back at her unbeatable rival, her sovereign, the most powerful person in England, attacking, if not with her nails, then with these sharper words. And when the water of the goddess's eyes makes almost alive the marble of my child, one bids her leave still her dolour so extreme, telling her it is not her young son Pampheme, to which she makes answer with voice inflamed, feeling therewith her venom to be more bitter, as I was of Cupid, even so of its mother. Pampheme is another name for Cupid, Venus's love child, a term consistent with the bard's little love god in sonnets 153 and 154. Anne tells us she remains venomously jealous and bitter over the Queen and her love child with Oxford. Anne told the Queen to her face that her show of tears about little Lord Bulbeck was false drama. It was not the Queen's 9-year-old son by Oxford who had just died. It has been proposed since the 18th century that Pandora's rarity indicates it was suppressed immediately. I think it was because of Anne's poems, confirming the Queen's concealed heir by Anne's husband. There is no reason for Anne to be venomously jealous and bitter over the Queen and her Pampheme, unless Oxford were the boy's father. Nor would cautious Anne take a risk with lines of searing hatred against her monarch, on whom her life and her father's position depended, unless she had very personal and a true basis for it, and she thought the verses would remain private. Pandora was not licensed by the Stationers' Company. We don't know who published it or who suppressed it, but opening Pandora's little box reveals Oxford, the Queen, and Anne, and it lets out Anne's roar. Anne is the most reliable witness possible to the existence of the Queen's concealed heir, because revealing his existence is against Anne's best interest. Therefore, Anne knew he existed, and her words are direct, not circumstantial evidence, but direct evidence of his existence. Pandora gave Anne's earth-shattering truth a stage and a spotlight. Torn for most of her life between her father, her husband, and Leicester, and by circumstances wildly beyond her control, Anne deserves her stage and her spotlight. Like Lucrece, she did what Oxford admired most and asked of her in that little Latin poem he sent from Venice. She told the truth as a Vere woman and a Shakespearean heroine. Thank you for listening.